Martin Heidegger was born in Germany in 1889 and is widely considered one of the most important and influential philosophers of all time. His magnum opus, Being and Time, is one of the most important pieces of phenomenological philosophy. Now, phenomenology studies conscious experience as experienced from the subjective or first-person point of view. It is the study of phenomena, or the appearance of things, or things as they appear in our experience, through our senses. In Being and Time, Heidegger tries to answer phenomenological questions on being through the perspective of Dasein. Dasein can be a complex concept to define, but in my view it relates to certain types of entities regarding their being. While we are Dasein, it does not mean a human entity, but rather a way of life shared by the members who exist in this world. In this video, however, I want to concentrate on Heidegger's views on entities within the world, so I won't go into depth into defining Dasein, but I will leave some resources in the description. Firstly, it is necessary to go over some background to explain the framework of where Heidegger is coming from. Heidegger is doubtful of the philosophers of the past, such as Descartes, Kant, and Hume, who viewed the world from the subject-object perspective. Heidegger alternatively views being in terms of what he calls being in the world. Being in the world cannot be thought of as merely spatial relation the subject has with the world. This is why Heidegger sometimes used the term dwelling to capture the distinctive manner in which Dasein is in the world. For example, to dwell in a house is not merely to be inside it spatially, rather it is to belong there, to have a familiar place there. This is how Dasein exists in the world. Heidegger is arguing against the dualism of subject-object, as one cannot exist without the other. We are not separate entities that are distinct from the world. Being for Heidegger is always being hyphenated in the world. Now that we have gone over some background, I can turn towards Heidegger's views on equipment. Using the example of a hammer, Heidegger explains different modes of being depending on how we encounter this piece of equipment. Firstly, he describes the present at hand, which is how we experience and define entities from purely observation and theoretical study. The present at hand is when we regard entities in other ways apart from their function and usability. In this way, the hammer is viewed as an object which weighs a certain amount of kilos. If a person has never seen a hammer before, then it becomes present at hand as a relatively heavy object made from wood and steel. It would not be hard to imagine a Neanderthal dealing with many modern day objects in this way, such as a gun appearing to be nothing more than a heavy metal object. The next mode is ready to hand, which is the experience we attain from using entities in the correct way, and therefore learning their purpose and meaning in the world. This relationship cannot be reached through the close observation or any theoretical study of the equipment. Heidegger states that equipment is essentially something in order to, which simply states that it is used in order to complete a certain task. The equipment is thus defined by the numerous methods of the in order to, such as an ability to manipulate. It is only through the practice of using these items of equipment that their nature becomes apparent. No matter how sharply we just look at the outward appearance of things, in whatever form this takes, we cannot discover anything ready to hand. The purpose of a piece of equipment is seen to become apparent through the use of that entity. However, this can insinuate that people must first put themselves into a position to experience the equipment's usability. This can be misleading, as the equipment's presence is not always forced upon Dasein to experience. Heidegger gives the example of opening a door. He describes that even though we may use doors every day, we may not notice the latch or hinges that control the action. This is universal to all equipment that we use throughout our lives. When equipment is ready to hand and is used in order to, the equipment itself fades from focus and is replaced by the work the equipment is doing. In this activity, a carpenter is not conscious of the hammer because it becomes transparent when used in the in order to activity. This is important to Heidegger as he believes that within the activity of hammering, it is not just the hammer that becomes transparent. Let us use this example of the carpenter to describe that when the hammering is taking place, the carpenter has no awareness of the hammer, the nail, the bench, or even himself. When Dasein is engaged in the activity of hammering, it appears that the tools in use become phenomenologically transparent. That is to say that when the carpenter is hammering a nail into a piece of wood, he is not experiencing these items in the same way as if he were to step back and think about them individually. The hammer becomes an extension of the carpenter's arm. The carpenter stops regarding himself as a subject in the world. This awareness that Heidegger calls circumspection comes into existence when we recede into the activity of using the equipment without concentrating on it. Phenomenologically speaking, during this activity there are no subjects and no objects. There is only the experience of the ongoing hammering. We may never step back and acknowledge the equipment until it breaks or something goes wrong and its usability changes. This leads us to what Heidegger calls the unready to hand, for when something changes how we view the equipment, such as the hammer breaking while we use it. If the hammer turns out to be damaged, or the material unusable, then the hammer, which has hitherto been viewed as ready to hand, is presented in a certain unreadiness to hand. Heidegger describes that when an equipment's unusability is discovered via circumspection, i.e. the use of that equipment, such as hammering with a hammer, the equipment becomes conspicuous. This conspicuousness presents the ready-to-hand equipment as in a certain unreadiness to hand. Heidegger describes that when this occurs, the object is thrust into becoming present at hand, but not in the same way that we experience things present at hand by mere observational theory, as I discussed earlier. If the hammer were suddenly to break, it may well become present at hand, but the function is still known because of it being in use up until this point. Therefore it is seen to be unready to hand. We can also experience the unready to hand when there are other objects that are not available, or as Heidegger says, handy, to complete the in order to. Heidegger posits that to miss something in this way amounts to coming across something unready to hand. I believe what is meant by this is that the hammer becomes unready to hand when other related entities such as nails or planks of wood are missing. We can therefore attain a ready-to-hand hammer is linked and dependent on a chain of other entities when engaged in the in order to activity. If any of the required equipment or materials breaks or becomes unusable, this affects the rest of the equipment and therefore the entire job. I will try to summarize these different modes of being experienced when encountering objects in the world. The hammer is a simple way of showing how we can experience the same piece of equipment in differing ways. Firstly, Heidegger shows that equipment can be experienced as present at hand by observing and studying the equipment, although no information about the purpose of the equipment can be discovered. Ready to hand is how we experience equipment such as the hammer when we are in the act of using it. We can obtain that all equipment has an in order to task, which is only discovered when we put that equipment to work. Lastly, unready to hand, which describes equipment like the hammer, but specifically when something has changed that affects the usability of the equipment. This can happen if the hammer breaks or the materials are unusable. Altogether, these modes of being explain how Dasein experience all equipment. Heidegger can be a very difficult philosopher to understand, and there are different theories on many of his doctrines. Making these videos is a way for me to learn and also try to understand these concepts as best I can. I hope you have enjoyed it, and leave a comment if you have any great resources that I haven't listed below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and goodbye.